The forest held its breath when Martha Ray pressed her torn dress against the cabin wall, believing the darkness would swallow her sobs whole. She had whispered those words, "Don't let them hear me cry," to the empty night, never knowing that someone already had. In the shadows beyond her broken world, a Lakota scout named Black Moon had been listening to her pain for weeks, each muffled cry cutting deeper than any blade. Tonight, as her husband's rage echoed through the Black Hills and the scent of blood mixed with pine, their two worlds would collide in ways that could destroy them both. Subscribe to discover how a woman's whispered prayer reaches the one person who might answer it. Martha Ray had learned to count the seconds between her husband's footsteps and the moment his fist would find her skin. Tonight, as she pressed her cheek against the splintered logs of their cabin wall, she counted 23 seconds of silence before the door exploded inward. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor had become the rhythm of her terror, each step a promise of pain that would follow. She had stopped praying to God months ago, but still found herself whispering to the darkness, begging it to swallow her whole before Thomas could reach her again. The bruises on her ribs had barely faded from last week's rage, purple and yellow reminders that painted her body like a map of his cruelty. Her wedding dress, once white as fresh snow, now hung in tatters in the corner, a ghost of the woman she used to be. The cabin that was supposed to be their new beginning in the Black Hills had become her prison, its walls witnesses to every scream she had learned to swallow. Thomas Ray stumbled through the doorway, his breath reeking of whiskey and the bitter disappointment that seemed to follow him like a shadow. His eyes, once blue as summer sky, now held the cold emptiness of a man who had lost everything and blamed the world for his failures. The mining claims had yielded nothing but dust and broken dreams, and each empty day drove him deeper into the bottle and closer to the edge of madness. Martha could see the familiar rage building in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as he searched for something to destroy. She had become his favorite target, the one thing in his life that couldn't run away or fight back without consequence. The gold he had promised her, the life he had sworn they would build together, had crumbled into nothing but violence and regret. Tonight, she could see in his eyes that the beating would be worse than usual, that something had broken inside him completely. "Where's my supper, woman?" His voice carried the slur of too much drink and too little hope, each word a threat wrapped in false civility. Martha's hands trembled as she pointed toward the cold stove, knowing that the burnt beans and stale bread would only fuel his anger further. She had learned that nothing she did would ever be enough, that his rage had nothing to do with her failures and everything to do with his own. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. She could feel the familiar terror rising in her chest, the way her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. The moonlight, streaming through the cracked window, seemed to mock her with its beauty, reminding her of a world beyond these walls where women didn't flinch at the sound of their husband's voice. Her fingers found the wooden cross around her neck, the one her mother had given her before she died, and she squeezed it until the edges cut into her palm. The first blow came without warning, his open palm connecting with her cheek, with a sound like thunder in the small space. Martha's head snapped to the side, stars exploding behind her eyes as she tasted blood on her tongue. She had learned not to cry out, not to give him the satisfaction of hearing her pain, but the tears came anyway, silent and hot against her burning skin. Thomas grabbed her by the hair, his fingers tangling in the brown strands that had once been her pride, and dragged her toward the center of the room. The wooden floor scraped against her knees as she struggled to keep her balance, her dress tearing further with each violent movement. She could hear him muttering curses under his breath, words that cut deeper than his fists ever could. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, the walls closing in like the jaws of some terrible beast. In that moment, Martha Ray understood that she might not survive another night of his rage. "Please," she whispered, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it, and she immediately regretted giving him the power of her desperation. Thomas's laugh was harsh and bitter, the sound of a man who had forgotten what mercy looked like. His grip tightened in her hair, pulling until she thought her scalp might tear, and she bit down on her tongue to keep from screaming. The taste of copper filled her mouth as she stared at the floor, counting the knots in the wood grain, to keep her mind from breaking along with her body. She thought of her sister back in Missouri, of the letters she could never send that would tell the truth about her life in the territories. The shame burned almost as much as the pain, the knowledge that she had become everything her mother had warned her against. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees, like the voices of all the women who had suffered in silence before her. As Thomas raised his fist again, Martha closed her eyes and whispered the words that had become her nightly prayer. "Don't let them hear me cry." She never imagined that someone already was listening, that in the shadows beyond her window, a pair of dark eyes had been watching her pain with growing concern. The forest held secrets deeper than her suffering, and tonight those secrets would begin to stir. Black Moon had been tracking the movements of settlers for weeks, but Martha's silent anguish had become a different kind of hunt, one that pulled at something in his chest he didn't understand. The sound of her breaking had become the sound that would change everything. Black Moon pressed his body against the rough bark of the ancient pine, his breathing controlled and silent as he had been taught since childhood. For 3 weeks he had watched the white woman through the cabin window, her pain calling to him across the divide of blood and history like a wounded animal's cry. His orders from the tribal council were clear: observe the settlers, report their movements, and remain invisible. But Martha Ray's suffering had become a weight in his chest that grew heavier with each passing night. The Lakota warrior had seen violence before, had dealt it himself when necessary, but there was something about the way she absorbed her husband's rage that reminded him of his own mother's final days. The memory of Standing Deer's broken spirit haunted him still, the way she had withered under his father's drunken fury until she simply stopped fighting back. Tonight, as he watched Thomas Ray's shadow move across the cabin wall like a demon dancing in firelight, Black Moon felt the familiar burn of helpless anger in his throat. The sound of the first blow reached him through the thin walls, sharp and cruel as a rifle crack in the stillness. Black Moon's jaw clenched involuntarily, his fingers tightening around the smooth wood of his bow until his knuckles went white. He had learned to read the rhythm of violence in this place, could predict the escalation by the heaviness of the man's footsteps and the length of silence between his curses. Martha's muffled whimper cut through the night air like a blade, and something deep in Black Moon's chest twisted with recognition. He thought of his sister, Singing Bird, who had married a white trader and disappeared into a world where her screams would never be heard by her own people. The warrior's training told him to remain hidden, to let the white man's cruelty play out as it always had. But his heart spoke in a different language, one that recognized suffering regardless of the color of skin that contained it. Through the cracked window, Black Moon could see Martha's silhouette pressed against the far wall, her body curved in on itself like a flower closing against winter's bite. The moonlight caught the tears on her cheeks, turning them to silver streams that seemed to glow in the darkness. Her lips moved in what looked like prayer, though no sound escaped them, and Black Moon found himself leaning closer, despite every instinct that screamed for him to retreat. He had been raised to see the white settlers as enemies, invaders who brought nothing but death and destruction to the sacred lands of his people. Yet this woman's pain spoke a language older than hatred, one that transcended the boundaries men drew between themselves. The warrior felt something shift inside his chest, a crack in the armor of indifference he had built around his heart. Martha Ray was no longer just another settler to be watched and reported. She had become a mystery that demanded solving. The violence inside the cabin escalated, Thomas Ray's voice rising to a roar that sent nightbirds scattering from their roosts. Black Moon watched Martha curl smaller, her hands pressed over her ears as if she could block out not just the sound, but the reality of her situation. The sight stirred memories he had tried to bury. His mother's face the morning she stopped speaking, the way she had looked through him as if he were already a ghost. Standing Deer had died not from her husband's fists, but from the slow poison of hopelessness, and Black Moon could see the same sickness beginning to take hold in the white woman's eyes. The warrior's breath came faster now, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the weight of recognition. He had been powerless to save his mother, had been too young and too afraid to stand between her and his father's rage. But he was no longer a frightened boy, hiding in the shadows of his family's lodge. A particularly vicious blow sent Martha crashing into the wall near the window, her body hitting the logs with a sickening thud that seemed to echo through Black Moon's bones. For a moment she lay still, and the warrior felt his heart stop in his chest, certain that Thomas Ray had finally gone too far. Then Martha stirred, pushing herself up on trembling arms, and Black Moon saw something in her face that made his breath catch. Not just pain, but a flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. She turned her head toward the window, and for one impossible moment, their eyes met through the glass. The connection lasted only seconds, but it was enough to change everything. Martha's lips parted in surprise, her hand rising instinctively to her throat, while Black Moon felt the world tilt beneath his feet. In that brief exchange, he saw not an enemy or a stranger, but a woman whose spirit was fighting the same battle his mother had lost. The moment shattered when Thomas Ray grabbed Martha by the arm and hauled her away from the window, his curses filling the cabin like poison smoke. Black Moon pressed himself deeper into the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs as he processed what had just happened. The woman had seen him, had looked directly into his eyes, with a mixture of fear and desperate hope that cut him to the bone. He should run, should disappear into the forest, and never return to this place of white man's violence. His people would call him a fool for risking exposure, for caring about the suffering of their enemies. But as Martha's muffled sobs reached him through the night air, Black Moon knew he could no longer simply watch from the shadows. The sound of her breaking had become the sound of his own conscience awakening, and there would be no peace for him until he found a way to answer her silent cry for help. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mining trail as Martha emerged from the cabin, her movements careful and deliberate, like a wounded animal testing each step. The purple bruises along her jaw had deepened overnight, painting a map of violence across skin that had once known only gentle touches. She carried the water bucket with both hands, not from its weight, but because her left wrist throbbed with each heartbeat, swollen from where Thomas had twisted it during his rage. The forest seemed different now, charged with an awareness she couldn't name, as if the very trees had witnessed her shame and were holding their breath in sympathy. Black Moon watched from his elevated position among the pine boughs, his body motionless, but his spirit in turmoil. 3 days had passed since he first heard her weeping, and each night had brought fresh sounds of brutality that carved deeper wounds into his conscience. The warrior code of his people spoke of protecting the innocent, yet here he sat, bound by duty to remain hidden while a woman suffered mere yards from his watch post. His fingers traced the leather grip of his knife, not in preparation for violence, but in a gesture of frustrated helplessness that had become as familiar as breathing. The morning light revealed details his night vision had only suggested, the careful way she favored her right side, the tremor in her hands that spoke of fear made flesh. As Martha knelt by the stream, her reflection wavered in the moving water like a ghost of the woman she used to be. The face that stared back bore little resemblance to the hopeful bride who had followed Thomas West with dreams of building a life together. That woman had believed in love's power to transform, had trusted in promises whispered under starlit skies back in Missouri. Now she saw only a stranger wearing her features, marked by violence and hollowed by despair. The water was cold against her bruised skin, but she welcomed the sharp sensation. It reminded her that she could still feel something other than fear. She cupped the clear liquid in her palms and let it run through her fingers, watching it disappear into the earth like tears that would never be enough to wash away her pain. The sound of approaching hoofbeats shattered the morning's fragile peace, and Martha's body tensed with the automatic response of prey sensing a predator. Thomas was returning from town earlier than expected, his horse's gait uneven, with the rider's drunken swaying. She could hear him singing, a slurred, off-key melody that had once charmed her but now served as a warning bell of impending violence. Her hands shook as she filled the bucket, water sloshing over the rim in her haste to return to the cabin before his mood could darken further. The bruises on her body throbbed in remembered agony, each mark a testament to previous homecomings that had ended in blood and tears. She knew the pattern by heart now, the false joviality that would gradually give way to accusations, then rage, then the terrible silence that followed his fists. From his hidden perch, Black Moon felt his muscles coil with the instinct to intervene, his warrior's training warring with his mission's demands. He had tracked enough hunting parties to recognize the signs of a predator returning to familiar territory, and every fiber of his being screamed against allowing the cycle to continue. The woman below moved with the desperate efficiency of someone who had learned to navigate around violence, her every gesture calculated to avoid triggering the storm she knew was coming. His hand moved unconsciously to the eagle feather woven into his hair, a symbol of his people's connection to the spirit world and a reminder that some duties transcended the boundaries of tribe and blood. The morning wind carried the scent of her fear, sharp and metallic like blood on stone, and he knew that his time of passive observation was drawing to a close. Martha reached the cabin door just as Thomas's horse stumbled into the clearing, the animal's labored breathing testament to a hard ride fueled by whiskey and whatever demons drove her husband through the night. She set the bucket down with trembling hands and smoothed her hair, trying to arrange her features into an expression that might deflect his attention from her bruises. The wooden door felt solid against her back as she pressed herself against it, gathering courage for the performance that might determine whether she lived through another day. In the distance, she thought she heard the call of an eagle, its cry piercing the morning air like a prayer sent skyward, a sound that somehow gave her strength to lift her chin and face whatever fresh hell awaited her inside those log walls. The cabin door slammed shut with the finality of a coffin lid, and within moments the sounds of Thomas's rage began to seep through the chinks in the logs like poison through cracked earth. Black Moon descended from his perch with the fluid grace of shadow-made flesh, his moccasined feet finding purchase on stone and root without disturbing so much as a fallen leaf. The warrior's training that had kept him hidden for weeks now served a different purpose, bringing him close enough to witness the full scope of the woman's torment. Through a gap in the cabin's rear wall, he could see her pressed against the far corner, her arms raised defensively as Thomas's voice rose to a roar that sent birds fleeing from nearby trees. The sight ignited something primal in Black Moon's chest, a fury that burned hotter than any battle rage he had known. Martha's world had narrowed to the space between her husband's fists and the rough-hewn wall at her back, each blow landing with the precision of long practice. Thomas had perfected the art of inflicting maximum pain while leaving minimal visible evidence, a skill learned from years of avoiding questions from the few neighbors who might care enough to ask. His words cut deeper than his hands, accusations of worthlessness and betrayal that found their mark in the tender places where her self-worth had once lived. She had stopped trying to defend herself months ago, had learned that silence was her only shield against the storm of his hatred. Yet even as her body absorbed the familiar punishment, her spirit seemed to float above the violence, detached and observing as if watching someone else's nightmare unfold. The sound of splintering wood announced the destruction of another piece of furniture, the small table where she had once imagined sharing quiet meals with the man she thought she had married. Thomas's rage was a living thing that fed on destruction, growing stronger with each broken dish, each torn curtain, each piece of their life together reduced to kindling. Martha watched the remnants of her hope scatter across the floor like autumn leaves, each fragment a memory of dreams that would never take root in this poisoned soil. Her wedding dress, carefully preserved in a cedar chest, lay trampled under his boots. The white fabric, now stained with mud and whiskey, a fitting metaphor for the purity she had brought to this union. The irony was not lost on her that the dress meant to symbolize new beginnings, now marked the death of everything she had once believed about love. Outside, Black Moon's hands clenched into fists as he listened to the symphony of violence, his warrior's code demanding action while his mission required restraint. The woman's silence was perhaps the most heartbreaking sound of all, not the absence of voice, but the presence of a spirit so thoroughly broken that it no longer believed in the possibility of rescue. He had seen this same defeated quiet in captured animals, the moment when they stopped struggling and accepted their fate with a resignation that spoke of hope's complete extinction. Yet something in her stillness called to him, a quality of endurance that reminded him of the sacred cottonwood trees that bent but never broke in the fiercest prairie winds. She was not merely surviving, she was preserving something essential within herself, protecting it like an ember kept alive through the longest winter. The violence inside the cabin reached its crescendo, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, fell into the terrible quiet that always followed Thomas's rages. Black Moon heard the heavy footsteps moving toward the door, the scrape of boots on wooden planks, and the creak of hinges as the man emerged into the afternoon light. Thomas stood swaying in the doorway, his knuckles bloody and his face flushed with the satisfaction of dominance reasserted. He wiped his hands on his shirt with casual indifference, as if cleaning away the evidence of chopping wood rather than beating his wife, then stumbled toward the lean-to where his horse waited with the patience of an animal accustomed to its master's unpredictable moods. The sight of him filled Black Moon with a cold fury that settled in his bones like winter ice, a rage that would not be easily thawed. As Thomas rode away toward whatever saloon or gambling den would claim his attention until nightfall, Martha emerged from the cabin like a ghost, returning to the world of the living. Her movements were careful and measured, each step a negotiation with pain that had become her constant companion. She began the ritual of cleaning up the destruction, gathering broken pieces with hands that shook not from fear now, but from a rage so deep it had crystallized into something harder than diamond. Black Moon watched her work, saw the way she handled each fragment as if it were precious, and understood that she was not merely cleaning. She was performing a ceremony of resurrection, refusing to let the violence erase every trace of the life she had tried to build. In that moment, he knew that his mission had changed, that some duties transcended the boundaries of tribe and nation, and that the woman below had become his responsibility in ways that had nothing to do with orders from distant chiefs. Night fell across the Black Hills like a curtain drawn over secrets too dark for daylight to witness, and Martha sat alone in her devastated cabin, surrounded by the wreckage of another day survived. The silence pressed against her eardrums with the weight of accumulated sorrows, broken only by the distant howl of wolves that seemed to echo the cry trapped in her own throat. Her hands moved mechanically as she attempted to mend a torn curtain, the needle catching the lamplight as it wove through fabric that would never again hang straight or clean. Each stitch was an act of defiance against the chaos that threatened to consume her, a declaration that she would not surrender completely to the darkness that had invaded her life. The thread kept breaking, forcing her to start again and again, until the simple task became a metaphor for her entire existence, always beginning anew, always hoping this time would be different. Black Moon had positioned himself closer to the cabin as darkness deepened, his presence a silent sentinel against the night's uncertainties. The woman's lamp cast a golden rectangle of light through the single window, and within that frame he could see her bent over her mending, her profile etched with a determination that spoke of strength he was only beginning to understand. She had cleaned the blood from her lip and arranged her hair to hide the worst of the bruising, but nothing could disguise the careful way she held herself, protecting ribs that might be cracked and a spirit that was certainly fractured. The sight of her solitary struggle stirred something in his chest that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with recognition, the acknowledgement of a kindred soul who understood what it meant to endure when endurance seemed impossible. The sound of approaching horses shattered the night's fragile peace, but these were not the unsteady hoofbeats of Thomas returning drunk from town. These riders moved with military precision, their mounts' shoes striking stone in the rhythmic cadence of cavalry on patrol. Martha's head snapped up from her sewing, her body tensing with a different kind of fear as she recognized the sound that had haunted her nightmares since the first reports of Indian raids had reached the settlement. Through the window, she could see the flicker of torches moving through the trees, and she knew that her isolated cabin had finally drawn the attention of forces beyond her husband's personal brand of violence. The needle slipped from her nerveless fingers as she realized that the sanctuary of her suffering was about to be invaded by a conflict that dwarfed her private hell. From his concealed position, Black Moon counted 6 soldiers moving in a loose formation that spoke of men more accustomed to intimidation than actual combat. Their leader rode with the swagger of authority unchallenged, his uniform bearing the insignia of a lieutenant who had likely never faced a real enemy, but had grown drunk on the power to terrorize civilians. The patrol's purpose was clear. They were hunting for signs of Indian presence, following reports of tracks and disturbed campsites that had filtered back to the fort through frightened settlers and ambitious scouts. Black Moon's jaw tightened as he recognized the type of men who saw every shadow as a threat and every native face as an enemy, soldiers who would shoot first and fabricate justification later. The irony was not lost on him. That his presence here, meant to gather intelligence on military movements, had now placed him in the position of potential protector for the very people his chiefs considered invaders. The soldiers dismounted with the casual arrogance of men who believed their authority extended over every living thing within 100 miles, their spurs jingling like death bells as they approached the cabin door. Martha stood frozen in the lamplight, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end in disaster. If they found evidence of Indian presence, they would assume she was either dead or complicit. If they discovered her husband's absence, they might decide she needed their particular brand of protection. The lieutenant's fist hammered against the door with the force of absolute power, and she knew that her response in the next few moments would determine whether she lived to see another dawn. Her hand trembled as she reached for the latch, and in that instant of hesitation, she heard something that made her blood freeze, the soft whisper of movement in the darkness beyond the window, a sound so subtle it might have been the wind, but which her heightened senses recognized as something far more dangerous. Black Moon had moved to within striking distance of the soldiers, his knife drawn and his body coiled for action that would likely mean his death, but might buy the woman precious seconds to escape. The warrior's code demanded that he protect the innocent, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances that had brought them together in this moment of crisis. As Martha's hand touched the door latch, he made a decision that would echo through both their lives, stepping from the shadows into the circle of torchlight, his presence transforming the night from a simple patrol into a confrontation that would test every assumption about enemy and ally, predator and prey, in a land where the only law was survival and the only mercy was what people chose to show each other in the darkness between heartbeats.